Hi, I'm Lucas.
And I'm Brian.
And this is the Quax Podcast. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. So, I have another interview for you guys today. I am getting more and more interested in the microbiome and its just effects on our health. So I've been seeking out people to interview on the subject. So today I have on Kristina Campbell. She's a contributing editor at Microbiome Times, and she's been a science writer in biotechnology and the microbiome for many years. She is an author of the book, The Well-Fed Microbiome Cookbook, published in 2016, and the co-author of an academic textbook, Gut Microbiota: Interactive Effects on Nutrition and Health. She has a website, bykriscampbell.com, with articles and a newsletter on the microbiome, all really interesting stuff. She gives a great synopsis of where the science is at right now. And really, it's just getting started, but, microbiome research is one of the fastest growing areas of research out there. So enjoy the interview. Hey, Kristina, how are you doing? Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
So I'm really happy to have you here and dive into this whole microbiome thing. It is a bit like going down a rabbit hole. There are so many different bacteria all having an effect on your health as well as each other, and trying to change it just seems kind of like trying to hit a moving target. So I'm really happy you're here. Before we dive in, can you tell the audience about yourself and just how you became interested in this topic?
Yes, I'm very happy to be here, Lucas. So I'm a writer, and it was about 10 years ago, I was having a lot of digestive issues of my own, really could not seem to figure out what was wrong, and I kept having these symptoms. I think it's a pretty common story, especially for women, and I went to my doctor, I didn't get the answers I needed, and that would relieve the symptoms. So I started looking into digestive health, and I came across a community of people who did fermented foods. And through that, I started learning about the microbial communities, and I became aware of this really fast-growing, emerging area of science, which was microbiome analysis. And it was being applied to foods, but also to the human body and to environmental areas and samples. So since then, I just started saying, "Wow, this is amazing," and then I couldn't stop learning.
Wow, that's pretty awesome. If you don't mind, I don't know if it's too personal, you don't have to share, but what kind of symptoms were you having?
Essentially, it was symptoms like irritable bowel syndrome, although I never got that diagnosis. And so, of course, at the time, my doctor recommended getting celiac disease testing and a lot of things. And I was experimenting with my diet, trying to figure out if I could reduce the symptoms. But in the end, I didn't get a diagnosis, and I just really kind of changed my diet and my lifestyle a lot to eventually kind of overcome the symptoms. And today I don't have them anymore, but I sort of attribute sort of a long process of small tweaks to the reason I don't have the symptoms.
Okay. So if someone is new to the microbiome, they've never really heard of it before, what's the 30,000 foot view perspective? What do they need to know?
So basically, and this is what just got me right away, and I'm a science writer, and this just blew me away when I realized this, that, you have as many or more microbial cells in the envelope of your body than human cells. And I mean, just right away, that has implications, right? You've got all this genetic material that's not yours. And then the whole process of the past 20 years and into the future is a scientific process of figuring out what that means and what that means for health. So that's the main thing to know. And I guess just on a superficial level, some have called this collection of microorganisms associated with your body, they've called it an organ, or they've called it like a living ecosystem of which you are a part. There's different ways to describe it, but essentially it is being linked with all kinds of functions in your body. A huge one is the immune system and modulating levels of certain immune cells, depending on which bacteria you have, especially in your gut. Linked to metabolic health, and we'll probably talk more about that later. and linked to even aspects of brain function through the gut-brain axis and the influence of the microbes. So just, you can think of the profound influences on health and disease that are just, we're starting to uncover them, but the potential is there.
Yeah, I think potential is a really good word. You mentioned that we have more of these bacteria in our, guts or in our bodies than we do cells. I'm trying to kind of wrap my head around that. What does that imply? Does it imply that they're more important in some ways than our cells, or what does that mean?
It's really hard to say. It could. There's certainly a lot more genetic information contained in the microbes than in your body. And so, scientists who worked in the field 20, 30 years ago have told me that, when the human genome was finally sequenced, people were really excited because they thought they had unlocked they were going to unlock everything there was to know about human disease, because all you had to do was correlate it with the right genes. But now this, they realize that's not always possible. And now this is kind of a similar phase where you're like, the scientists are thinking, maybe if we take the genetic plus the microbiome information, combine all that, maybe we can, get a little further in understanding some of these diseases that, quite frankly, we have no idea, the etiology of them. There's a ton of chronic diseases, as you probably well know, that medical science, there may be some treatments, but we really don't know where they come from. We know there are genetic risk factors, but that doesn't account for all of, why they happen. So I think this is a really exciting field in that it combines things we know about diseases from the past, from the research that's already been done, and adding this new facet and seeing if, using sophisticated techniques like machine learning and, the bioinformatics applications to microbiome data, they can figure out, or predict better who will get it and how they get it.
Okay. So how tightly do you think the microbiome and, its change and then people's symptoms changing, how tightly do you think those things correlate? If somebody changes their microbiome, will their symptoms change, or is it kind of a loose correlation? I don't know. Do you kind of see what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think so. It really depends on the disease. And I think by now at this stage in the research, there are multiple lab groups around the world working on almost every chronic disease you can think of. And it's going to be probably a different relationship between the microbiome and the symptoms in every case. So I guess the one that's the closest linked at the moment is recurrent C. difficile infection. And of course, you may know, it's just as an overview, when people are in hospital and taking a lot of antibiotics, they tend to get colonized by this pathogen called C. difficile, Clostridioides difficile. It's been renamed recently from Clostridium difficile.
Oh,
anyhow, so essentially, the gut, the colon, gets wiped out by the antibiotics, leaves room for the pathogen to colonize, and people get very sick. And then, of course, the treatment is more antibiotics. And, it can create a vicious cycle where people clear up on antibiotics, then they're more susceptible to the pathogen again, happens again and again, and it recurs. And, eventually the people are really, almost near death. So it's really quite life-threatening. But what they've found is that replacing the microbial community through a fecal microbiota transplant, which is essentially, poop from a healthy person, it clears this up almost immediately. And so that, that's a pretty compelling case that the microbiome plays a big role in that condition. But for almost every other condition, it's not as clear. Fecal transplants have been tried in clinical trials for a lot of different conditions, not with anywhere near the level of success. But there are other ways that scientists are trying to get at the causality.
Yeah, that is really interesting. We did a podcast about antibiotics and we talked about C. diff, and it's just a horror story if you get that. I mean, you end up having to take a lot of antibiotics of like last resort, and it just nukes your entire gut of healthy bacteria. So, I mean, that I just can't imagine it.
Right. And I guess for listeners who are not familiar with what antibiotics do, yeah, essentially, you have this beautiful, thriving ecosystem normally in your gut, and antibiotics, no matter why you're taking them, they are a bit of a carpet bomb, right? They kill quite a few of the microbes, and narrow spectrum antibiotics are better than the broad spectrum, but the broad ones, kind of indiscriminately kill a lot of the microbes. The good news is in adults, often the community bounces back. When they've studied patients over a course of a few weeks, often the microbes bounce back, but sometimes they don't, or sometimes key species are still missing after this course of antibiotics. So, I think it's just worth considering that when taking antibiotics for non-life-threatening reasons.
Yeah. So one thing you mentioned was the ecosystem, and I learned from Ken Lassison, who runs this site, about, the microbiome and chronic fatigue, that, these bacteria, they have different levels, and a good bacteria at a very high level might actually be harmful. It might do the opposite in you. And a bad bacteria at a very low level might actually provide some benefits. Is this true, or have you heard of anything like this?
Absolutely. Like, it's so complex when you're talking about ecosystems. And it makes sense in a way if you just think of a simple, well, not even simple, an ecosystem in a forest, right? It's very hard to label even one type of organism as good or bad. So, you might have bears in this forest. Are bears good or bad? Well, that depends how many and in what context. Are mosquitoes good or bad? Are dragonflies good or bad? Are pine trees? So it's very hard to label per se, a microbe as good or bad. So I think among the scientists, they just don't. I mean, there are things called pathogens, which are, yes, they cause disease in humans. So those can fairly be called bad bugs. But as for the rest, it's really not clear. And I guess the closest to good bugs might be the bacteria that fall under two categories. Those are lactobacilli and bifidobacteria. And those are, each of those categories has a huge variety of microbes. And in fact, the lactobacilli, just as a side note, have just been split into 25 further groups by scientists just last month. So they're not all called lactobacillus anymore. But essentially, these two historical groups of bacteria are the main ones that you would find in probiotics. And they're present, a lot of them are present naturally in the human gut and are sort of the purportedly good bugs. But then again, we don't know how much of them. We don't know if you can have too many. What happens, if your body's dealing with too many. So yeah, I would hesitate to call them, categorically good.
Yeah, it's tough because I know the Ken Lassison guy, one thing he found was that people with chronic fatigue actually tend to have too much lactobacillus, and bringing those down ended up helping a lot of them, which I thought was very strange because what you hear is lactobacillus is good, bifido is good. So, I mean, it is kind of a wacky situation.
Right. But then if you consider the overall context, yeah, maybe there's a reason, that it was good to bring down that, because then some other bugs who had a good function could thrive. Or yeah, it's all very complicated, and definitely, people who are getting the microbiome testing at this stage, we really can't tell much just by looking at what's there in your gut. Can't tell much about your health at all. But I think in the future, when we have more sophisticated algorithms and such that link these to health, we'll be able to tell much more.
Gotcha. So I think one thing most people are interested with the microbiome is probably its ability to change the metabolism, and help them lose weight. What have you found in the research in these areas?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think several years ago, there were some very exciting mouse studies that showed, weight was modulated in mice by just simply replacing the bacteria in their guts. And I think that was really neat research, but it's really, the follow-up work has not managed to show the same phenomenon in humans. So the thing is, I think currently in the research, and I just did a webinar on this for dietitians with a dietitian friend of mine, Natasha Haskey. So there's a difference between sort of the blood sugar spikes and insulin resistance versus the actual weight. So they both kind of are related to, metabolism, but the microbes seem much more involved in the insulin resistance and the type 2 diabetes kind of symptoms rather than actual weight. And that bears out on a couple of levels. I think some probiotics seem to be effective at sort of managing the symptoms of type 2 diabetes and the insulin spikes. And whereas it's really hard to find a probiotic, if there are indeed any, that would actually modulate weight. I think, there are some promising ones that maybe have 1 or 2 studies done about them, some promising probiotic strains by various companies. But yeah, as a rule, if you just take probiotics, you shouldn't expect to lose weight.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there does seem to be a lot of agreement around the Akkermansia bacteria. I'm not sure if you've heard of that one, that it helps with metabolic disease. Would that be one of those bacteria that could help people be slimmer?
It's possible. I think it's just being tested. So I guess a couple things about Akkermansia.
Sure.
There are various strains of it, obviously. So the thing about probiotics, when you use them to modulate your gut microbiota or achieve any sort of health benefit, it's important to know what strain you're working with, because even different species have multiple strains that could all do different things. So and so I think they found, so some strains are what they call generally regarded as safe or GRAS. So they can be available as probiotics under the current sort of regulatory regime. And in fact, there's one, I think one company has a multi-strain probiotic with Akkermansia, an Akkermansia strain that is for type 2 diabetes and managing HbA1c levels, I believe.
Interesting.
And so that one is available now, but some strains of Akkermansia are not sort of they don't have the GRAS status. And so they therefore have to go through testing as drugs and be administered like for a disease as a drug. And so this is happening as well. I think a group in Belgium is working on a strain or maybe more than one strain of Akkermansia as a drug for, weight loss or some other kind of metabolic endpoint. So I think, the jury's out. And the interesting part of the work from Belgium was that they pasteurized the Akkermansia in one of the trials. They killed it, basically, and found that it still worked. And it was just one of the proteins in the bacteria that actually had the effect.
Wow.
And in that case, I anticipate they would not give the live bug, because that, from a regulatory perspective, that's very complicated and introduces a lot of problems with, getting this product to consumers in a way that's, makes the bug stay alive. So I anticipate, if they found it was the protein, they would just administer the protein somehow and to have the same effect. So it's definitely one to watch, although I think, at present, there's not much people can do in terms of like going out and getting Akkermansia. Again, there's that multi-strain probiotic for that specific reason of type 2 diabetes.
Yeah. Do you know if that's through a prescription or can people buy that online?
I believe it's the status is a medical food, so you can buy it directly. A doctor can recommend it, but it is sort of available to people. And I think the company is called Pendulum.
Pendulum. Okay, I'll try and find that and put that in the show notes. So with Akkermansia, I've kind of done some research on perhaps ways to raise it. I know cranberry and pomegranate might be a way to raise it. And I know metformin, there's some studies showing metformin actually raises Akkermansia. Do you know of any ways to increase it off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head, but I think you've hit on something really important there with the diet, because, what I didn't say before is that the microbiome in the gut is profoundly influenced by diet. And so when we change the way we eat or increase certain foods, definitely we're able to modulate the bugs that are there, and possibly in a good way to affect a disease or a condition we might have. So yeah, I think that's a really key thing. And I focus a lot on diet. In fact, I wrote a textbook on gut microbiota and diet with Natasha Haskey, who's a dietitian, and Ed Ishiguro, who's a professor of microbiology. And I guess, laying out the parameters for this. And basically, I think that the overview of it is that, to the extent that diet can affect the course of a disease, the microbiome might be the reason for that. So in some cases, so, inflammatory bowel disease, for example, I'm not sure if you know anyone with that.
Yeah, I know some people with that.
Yeah. And so, I have a lot of family members with that, and they're always trying to change their diets to try to, tamp down the inflammation so they don't have a flare. And some of them, have very eclectic eating patterns or eating regimes to try to keep the inflammation low. But if you look at the research, and if you ask most doctors, they say, well, we don't know what is the diet for IBD. Like there's nothing that's been proven to help IBD. So you're just kind of, you're self-experimenting, and there's no science to it. But, so essentially it seems very personalized. And now there's this body of work that shows, well, maybe it's kind of the combination of the diet you have and then the microbes you have that contributes to the inflammation and to a flare. And so that would explain why people have such personalized diets that seem to improve symptoms for them. So this is an ongoing body of work, and I really hope it bears fruit soon. Just really being precise about, which bugs and which diet in combination will, keep you symptom-free.
Yeah. You mentioned fermented foods. Do you have any fermented foods that you like, and maybe some that you don't like?
Yeah, I love fermented foods. I love eating them. And I'm such a fan of the people who make them. That's initially how I got into this whole field, in just the beautiful idea that you're creating something out of your own environment. You're inviting the microbes in your environment into your food to change it, and then to you consume that. So I just love that idea. And yeah, I guess it's funny now with the pandemic, I've been focusing a little more on some fermented foods of my own. I've always done, even before the pandemic, I had a kefir that I loved. And kefir is actually one of the better fermented foods if you want to modulate your gut microbiota. Some of the food scientists that I've talked to have said that is one fermented food that does have a measurable effect, even more than yogurt, for what that's worth.
What do you mean by modulate?
So that when you eat it in like a decent enough amount, you can actually see a difference before and after in your microbiome. Wow. So something about the kefir changes the composition of the microbes in your gut. That's in contrast with maybe something like yogurt. Sometimes you can pick up the yogurt microbes in the gut, but most of the time they kind of pass right through and they don't colonize, so you can't detect them once you eat them. So, I mean, it's not necessarily that they have to colonize to get any health effect, because I think yogurt has been shown to have some good health effects. But if your goal is to modulate your gut, then yeah, kefir is a good one. And I have a kefir grains that I keep, and I consume the kefir.
Nice.
Kombucha, that's personally, I'm not that much into kombucha, but some people love it. And I have just, during the pandemic, gotten a sourdough starter from a friend.
Oh, nice.
So that's really, it's been fun to experiment with that. And that one's a bit different because when you consume the bread, the microbes are not alive anymore. So some people say, oh, maybe that's a sign they're not as, effective. I don't know the health effects of the, the dead microbes, but certainly any food with live microbes has the potential to have, some sort of health benefit.
Gotcha. So one thing that I don't know anything about, and I know you've looked into quite a bit, are these fecal transplants, where basically, like you said, you take some healthy person's poop and put it in your colon. So what can you tell us about these?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, in medicine, they're really only, appropriate to be used for recurrent C. difficile infection, as we chatted about. And all other reasons are experimental. And when I first learned of these, I thought it was so compelling. And I thought, wow, is this a new medicine you could administer yourself? And it's really cool and it could have profound effects.
Yeah.
But, the more people I talked to, especially, in the medical field, they said, well, okay, just examine the logic here. So if you think that a lot of these chronic diseases are, have some causal relationship with the gut, and you want to go around, replacing those gut microbes, giving people a new, inoculation, if you will, with gut microbes, you could be doing something profound to their health. And if it's a chronic disease, it might not show up right away. And so I came to think, there's actually kind of a safety risk here. In fact, possibly a big safety risk that you could be transferring chronic disease. Anecdotally, I know of somebody who had a fecal transplant and developed a severe anxiety. That's just one personal, connection that I had, but so it's not scientific. But there is also I think the American Gastroenterological Association is now keeping a database of people who get fecal transplants for C. difficile and trying to track any side effects that are reported years and years later. So I think we're in the middle of learning about that. There might be some unexpected effects over time, and that there's a registry to track that. So I guess to me, for my own health, I guess at this point I would be very reluctant. I would not do a fecal transplant unless I had recurrent C. diff. And for all other, indications, I'd probably wait until there's more medical evidence that could help. And there are also, I think, companies trying to develop products that would take away the risk and give the benefits of a fecal transplant. And so creating cocktails of bugs that are meant to, because I guess sometimes during a fecal transplant, you can transplant viruses that are, there aren't very many of them in there, but they could potentially, given the right conditions, really make you sick. And so in they're called synthetic cocktails or whatever of bugs, those are not present even in trace amounts, right? It's just a completely sort of clean consortia of bugs. And some of them, who knows if they're effective? There are some going through clinical trials right now, and I guess time will tell.
Yeah, so probably not something people should do at home.
No, at this point, I am convinced of that it's not a completely safe thing. And especially if you get, I don't know, I've heard of people getting samples from their neighbor who seems really healthy and runs marathons, for example.
Yeah.
But, it's impossible when you're, an individual to test that sample for every possible thing. And it's very expensive to test it for every possible thing that could be lurking in there that could possibly, make you more ill. Open Biome, they're based in Boston, and they have frozen fecal samples that they send out across the country. And they've had to increase the amount they've charged for those samples because the amount of testing they have to do on them is incredible. Like even one sample. And one of them, Mark Smith, when he was in charge of Open Biome, he said to me, we have a lot of applicants to donate these samples, but it's harder to get into MIT than it is to be accepted. You have a better chance of getting into MIT than to be accepted as a poop donor for Open Biome. So you have to be just that healthy, you know?
Wow. What are they testing for? I mean, you said viruses, but is there something else they're looking for?
All kinds of viruses and pathogens. I think they want to know multi-drug resistant organisms. Then, of course, at a time like this, they add on the testing for coronavirus. You know, every sort of new major pathogen that emerges, they've got to add that to the regimen. So, I think it just gets to be quite a lot.
Yeah.
And I think they have some recurrent donors, and sort of by now they're aware of anything major changes in this person's health, and they can be a donor, you know, unless something major changes.
So do you know why there's such a difference in, you know, taking probiotics or whatnot by mouth and then doing a fecal transplant? Because it seems like the fecal transplant is way more effective at changing the microbiome than taking, you know, a probiotic.
It's possible, yeah. I mean, you're definitely adding a lot more types of microbes with the fecal transplant. But it's funny because in some cases, even doing that, the microbiome sort of bounces back to what the recipient had before. So it's not like a guarantee that you'll change things if you have the fecal transplant. I think in recurrent C. difficile, you do often, like the recipient does often gain a set of gut bugs that look very similar to the donors. And, you know, the theory is that that's because it's sort of like it's been wiped out. It's kind of a barren landscape. And then this other sample, these other bugs come in and recolonize that landscape. But in many other diseases, like there's colonization resistance, right? Like there's already bugs there that don't want to give up their niche. They're stubborn.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to actually affect a change. And with probiotics, the thing about them is, you know, the analogy I've heard is kind of like dropping apple trees into a desert and expecting them to thrive. Well, they're probably not going to take root and and thrive. But
that's a good analogy.
On the other hand, probiotics, the science on them shows that they don't necessarily need to colonize and thrive there in order to have a health effect. So even by passing through as tourists through the gut, which they seem to do, they may be having some health effect by, you know, either boosting the level of certain immune cells or, however else, you know, boosting some kind of mucus layer, whatever mechanisms, and then that has an effect on health.
Okay. So I know in the email you said, you know, you may not have much in the way of actionable advice to give out, but from your research, you know, is there anything that you have changed in your life? You know, you mentioned before you had some IBS symptoms that affects your microbiome in a positive way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of something medical, there's not much actionable advice at this point. But I think definitely for me, it's been a whole process of learning about the microbiome and diet. And really the dietary change is where I've seen a difference in my life, I guess. And just, you know, I guess before I just really knew that food had an effect on my health, but the connection was not sort of very salient to me. And I would eat a lot of sugar and probably too many fried foods. And I didn't really see why that was so bad. But, you know, after learning more and writing more about the microbiome and talking to a lot of the nutrition scientists in the field, it's clear to me that the effect is more immediate. So what I eat is like immediately met by these microbes in my gut, and they try to make sense of it and, you know, do whatever they do with it. And if it's fiber, the microbes in the colon just love it and eat it up and then release these metabolites called short chain fatty acids, which again, there's a huge literature on them and how beneficial they are for various things in the body. And so, yeah, to me, it was like an aha moment when I realized, no, that like what you eat today, it matters. And okay, fine, like have a treat once in a while, but you need to feed them every day, feed them their fiber and the things they want. And, and that can have just like an effect. I almost feel more resilient that way, right? Giving the microbes what they need on a daily basis so that, they can thrive and then support my health. That's the realization that I've sort of made over time.
Okay. Is there maybe a list of foods that people could, put down and say, I'm going to try these and see what their effects are?
Yeah. So I guess the two main categories to consider would be probiotics and prebiotics. And I guess I'm hesitant to recommend exact foods for each one because I think, again, that it's so personal in terms of preferences and even the effects on your body, but I can list some. So in the prebiotics category, there are foods, and so prebiotics are essentially special forms of fiber. They don't have to be fibers, but often they are. Special forms of fibers that boost the good bacteria, that act as food for the good bacteria, so in the gut. And so these are, inulin is a very common one. You can find prebiotics in a lot of fruits and vegetables like I think onion, leek, bananas, the Jerusalem artichokes. If you can figure out how to cook with those, they have a high prebiotic content and a lot of vegetables. So yeah, you can look up lists of prebiotic foods, and those are great to add more to the diet.
Okay.
And there are also, of course, prebiotic supplements. Also, resistant starch is really good for feeding the microbes. And so, yeah, you can look up different supplements that might be useful.
Yeah. Are there any supplements that you like in particular?
I'm trying to think. Well, I actually, the one supplement that I take regularly is resistant starch. But yeah, there are different ones. There's xylo oligosaccharide, ZOS, and I think in the next while you'll see that one added to a lot of different foods. I think a lot of big food companies are thinking about ways to formulate different like snack foods and breakfast foods to incorporate some of these things. And then fructo oligosaccharides. So these are all things you'd see on a label of a food, or maybe just like in a supplement.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then the other category would be the probiotics. And considering maybe taking a supplement of probiotics, I do myself intermittently. I know I should probably be more, regular about that. But and the form that I preferred, this is just a personal preference, is the like the drink form, like the yogurt probiotics.
Okay.
Or like a yogurt drink type thing. That and the ones that list the strains that are in it, I think those are really, that it's sort of a higher quality product if it will list the actual strains that are contained in it. That's one way to know.
Okay. What if somebody can't do dairy? Is there an option for them?
Yeah, I think like something like the BioK Plus shots, they have a version that's soy.
Oh, okay.
And so you get the same probiotics in there, but with the soy base instead of the dairy base.
Okay. Are there any probiotics that maybe people should stay away from?
Again, I'm not sure. Like, it's probably quite personal because I know definitely when I was trying to get rid of my IBS symptoms, I tried several different probiotics and some had no effect. And then this one that I took, the symptoms were gone in like a day. So I did a lot of experimenting. And so I think it's hard to recommend one for all people. But it's just trying different types. Technically, there are, when you take a probiotic, technically you should be looking at the studies and seeing which probiotics are effective for which condition. And there are a number that can be effective for IBS or bloating, specific symptoms, that make up IBS. So, so I think it's hard to offer advice now. And in fact, some of the clinicians that are, experts in probiotics, clinicians and researchers, they even have trouble pinpointing which ones will work right now. But I think, as the body of evidence grows, it'll be much easier to zero in. But at this stage, it's kind of like, try one if you like it, and if it fits your lifestyle, then go with it.
All right. Well, this is kind of a crazy question that I ask a lot of my guests, but is there anything you see in either mainstream media or online that's very popular that you think is just really bad advice with the microbiome?
Oh, there's tons of it. Because it is such an interesting area and has so much potential. And I think I see a ton of people who have sort of jumped on the bandwagon. And, the thing that is hard for me, because, I'm a science writer and I care so much about the science, it's hard for me to see when people are talking sciencey, but it's not based on science. So I don't know, the old thing of blinding people with science. And I feel like that moves us backward, and people will start to have false hope, and then they'll be disappointed when the intervention or whatever it is, it can't deliver. So I guess a couple of just specific tips maybe that people can watch for, or that will help people to interpret some of the information they see about the microbiome. Yeah. One is, be very careful when you hear the phrase healthy microbiome. And I noticed, Lucas, you know enough about this area that I didn't hear you use that phrase today. And I think when a company uses that, like, this will give you a healthy microbiome, that's sort of it raises a question mark in my mind, because as far as the science, we don't know what a healthy microbiome is. And you and I, we just talked about the difficulty of even identifying, which bugs are good and how many of them you need. Mm-hmm. And so none of that has been sorted out. The microbiomes of healthy people are hugely variable. And so we just don't know what a healthy microbiome looks like. So therefore, if you're promised that, it may not be valid.
Yeah, that's actually really good, because, it's almost like saying, if you're building a house, like a healthy wrench or a healthy nail, or a healthy hammer, it's kind of like, is it the right tool for the job? And your genetics are going into whatever the bug's genetics and what it's doing. And so it really is a personalized thing for each person. So that makes total sense. And anything else you see out there?
Yeah, I guess just the language about what causes what. That's also sort of something that's commonly misused. And I think people can be sometimes quite glib about saying, oh, your microbiome controls your immunity. But if you try to look at that again, just like empirically, like, what does that mean? And so at a time like this too, we're dealing with this global pandemic of this, the coronavirus, I think it bears examining what exactly someone means by, your microbiome supports immunity, and whether that specific connection has anything to do with coronavirus. I think I've seen a lot of communication lately about probiotics supporting immunity, but again, like, the immune system is like a delicate balance too, and maybe you don't want to support immunity in the wrong way, because you could in fact increase your susceptibility potentially to the virus. So it's just worth really being careful about the language, I think, or when people hear about ways that the microbiome supports various body processes, to try to really get back to like a specific study, or really verify that.
Gotcha. Have you mentioned it? Have there been any studies on the microbiome and this virus that we're dealing with?
In fact, I just finished writing an article for an organization called ISAP. It's the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics. They wanted to just find out and do like a broad survey, like which researchers are working on that exact thing. And we found several that are trying to find out how microbiome science and probiotic science can be leveraged for possibly treatments or even preventative strategies for this coronavirus. So everything from as simple as like if you give probiotics to people in the ICU, are there better outcomes? There's a study, I think, kicking off about that. Or maybe it's not even in the intensive care unit, it's just anyone with coronavirus. But also, looking at, say, the lung microbiome and seeing if your starting lung microbiome has anything to do with the progression of the disease and your need for a respirator, that sort of thing. So these are kicking off right now, some of them, and I hope we'll have answers. I mean, it's hard with a novel pathogen, right? Because nobody in the world has studied it before because it's novel. So you've got to, all the science has to happen so rapidly. And of course, some of the first publications were coming out of China where they had it, and then now you're seeing publications by different, people in various places in the world, but it's all sort of a race to get data right now.
So one thing you mentioned was the lungs, and I didn't really ask about this, but different parts of your body have a different microbiome. What can you tell us about that?
Yes. So various parts of the body, they have different conditions. So if you think of the conditions in your gut where there's not a lot of oxygen, it's very moist, there's new materials coming in all the time in the form of food, that environment, as opposed to, let's say, your skin, the skin of your back, let's say, it's very dry, right? Lots of oxygen reaching it. So different conditions make different microbes want to grow there. And so you tend to have, and this was found in the Human Microbiome Project as well, which was one of the first large-scale surveys of the body microbiomes. It was found that, you have a very different typical microbiome on your back versus your gut, and all different parts of the body, even different skin microbiome sites. So like the palm of the hand versus the back.
Oh, wow.
Those are different microbes, the lung, the small intestine, the large intestine, the vaginal microbiome in women. So all these different sites have typically like different microbes that cluster there. And again, there's variation person to person, but you tend to have like, there's bounds around the types of microbes that colonize each site. Okay.
Do taking probiotics or changing your diet, does that change, your skin microbiome or your lung microbiome?
That's still a bit of an open question, but I think there has been some interesting research that, probiotics that reach the gut do have an effect on the vaginal microbiome of women. So now there's a bunch of scientists trying to figure out if you could have probiotics just like a supplement that would help things like bacterial vaginosis or things like that. So I think, it's sort of a beginning area of research, but I think there could be a lot of potential there. And it's kind of neat to think that something you take that reaches your gut could possibly influence another body site, like the lung, let's say.
It's wild.
And not just what you breathe, right? Because it seems more intuitive that what you breathe and if you smoke, that could influence the lung microbiome. And it seems to, but also, what you have in your gut.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we only have, a few more minutes. Is there anything we didn't cover that, might be interesting?
I think, so one other area might be early life.
Okay.
And I think that area will sort of grow in importance in the next years. And so there's a bit of debate over whether, when a baby's in utero, whether the baby is sterile or not, within the placenta. And some research groups are saying, yes, we've definitely found microbes in the placenta. There's definitely a microbiome there and it's influencing the baby. And others are saying, nope, that's contamination. We think that the baby is pretty sterile, if not completely sterile, before birth. And then when the baby's born, that's when it gets colonized with the first kind of wave of microbes. And of course, if a baby's born sort of vaginally, they get different microbes than if a baby is born via C-section. And the C-section babies tend to have microbes on their bodies that are more typical of the skin and the hospital surfaces, as opposed to, the birth canal. So there's some really interesting stuff. And then from that first inoculation of microbes in early life that we all had somehow or other, what does that mean for health? And there's this critical window to set up your immune system in early life. And, the microbes you have in that window may kind of set you up on a trajectory for the rest of your life. And so, again, this is, when we're talking about the origins of a lot of chronic diseases and what causes them, there's a thought that this could be part of it. This could be a major part, is the microbes you had at birth and shortly thereafter. And I'm not sure exactly how long the window is. Some people say 100 days, but it could be give or take. What microbes you had then and how that affected your immune system. So even that if your microbiome looks pretty normal later on, it's possible that you had things happen in early life that would have set you up for some, to be susceptible to some chronic disease. So that all has to be unraveled. Again, you can imagine how difficult the studies would be to try to track babies for years and years and see what happens and measure all these different aspects. But that is to come.
Yeah, I know in the natural world, there is a general belief that, that first, 100 days of your life, your bacteria and what you get and whether you have a C-section or you go through the birth canal, and that matters so much to your later health. And there's just, it's all anecdotal. There's just this belief that, people who have a cesarean section and then they don't get breastfed and then maybe they get antibiotics for ear infections a couple months later just seem sickly for their whole life. And obviously it's anecdotal. And what I hear you kind of saying is those would be really hard to study.
It would be, although I think scientists are making progress and they use different models to try to sort some of this out. But I think, we're getting closer. And what I find interesting too is, I had 2 kids and as a mother, it's interesting to kind of navigate nowadays the kind of Western medical system and the way to have a baby there, and versus some of the traditional supports that have been around women, and to learn around those, through history. So, the doulas are something that it's optional nowadays. Not a lot of people have them, but that was always something that women had in many societies, is like a kind of the birth coach and the emotional coach. Around birth, and now we've kind of swung the other way, where it's a very medicalized experience with lots of numbers involved as you're giving birth, right? Your rate, your heart rate, the baby's heart rate, all kinds of things, and just trying to figure out, how the microbiome was supported by these traditional practices, and how. Whether we need to move back toward some of those things because of how they protect the microbiome. For example, I guess these are questions I have. Do people who have a doula to support them through birth, are they less likely to have a C-section? I don't know the data on that, but those are the types of things too that I think could bring us to a really integrated picture of early life and birth, and how that supports the microbiome.
Yeah. One more quick question that I forgot to ask was about diversity. I know a lot of people talk about diversity and how, living in the cities and all of these antiseptics and stuff are damaging the diversity that we have. And when we don't have diversity, we can have health problems. Is there anything to that?
I have heard scientists say that. In fact, one conference I attended in February, a scientist from Spain was saying that he thinks, it's kind of a radical idea, but he thinks that microbiome diversity should be an end in itself, as a marker of health. Because definitely, across the board, almost, the higher the diversity in the gut, the better health. There are a couple of exceptions, I should say. That I think essentially one group found that if you were very constipated, like a slow intestinal transit time of food through your gut, that led to really high diversity. So that's obviously not a healthy thing, but that's the exception. And mostly, like with many diseases, the way that they look in your microbiome is that they reduce diversity. So yeah, like IBD and all kinds of other chronic diseases. So I think diversity is mostly a good thing. And yeah, people have hypothesized that there's this like missing microbes hypothesis where because of our modern lifestyles, as you say, like pollution and antibiotics and, poor foods, low fiber foods, we've kind of reduced the diversity, and that's a bad thing. That's probably true on a general level. Although at this point, we don't have a cutoff to say like, okay, you have enough diversity.
Yeah. Do you know of any ways to increase your diversity, like rolling around in the mud or something?
Well, definitely through diet, through more types of fibers in the diet. I think if you can do that I think the American Gut Project found people who ate 30 or more types of plants per week, so kind of any sort of plant food, they had the higher diversity score. So definitely through diet. I mean, and maybe, through, nature and exposing yourself to diverse sources of microbes. I guess there haven't been controlled studies on that, but I think it does make intuitive sense that, and it's hard for us now all of us who are asked to stay home right now. We don't exactly have the opportunities that we've normally had to get out and, expose ourselves to lots of microbes. But yeah, in general, and especially again, going back to early life, they say, there's a book by two scientists, and it's called Let Them Eat Dirt. And talking about the value of letting kids just get dirty and not in a way that's going to expose them to disease, but just kind of the nice clean dirt, like letting them out in the yard to play a lot and making mud pies and that sort of thing, that's good for microbial diversity.
Okay. Yeah. Let them eat the clean dirt, not the swamp dirt.
Yeah.
So what,
and like,
no, go ahead.
Well, and also, with animals, I think it's still worth being careful because, there can be different pathogens when the kids play with animals, like at a petting zoo or something. But in terms of just like, dirt out in the garden, I think that's the safer kind of dirt.
Yeah. I work with a company run by Brenda Watson. And I don't know if you know who Brenda Watson is, but she started Renew Life, which is one of the biggest probiotic makers out there. And she said that you could test an owner's microbiome and you could test the dog, their pet's microbiome. And without knowing which dog and which owner was to who, you could actually match them up because of their similar microbiome. And I thought that was crazy.
I would believe that, yeah. Because, even among humans, like a shared environment means you're more likely to have the same microbes. And yeah, with the dogs too, I have no doubt that's the case.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. All right, so what are you working on these days?
I'm doing a lot of writing for different publications. I'm a contributing editor at Microbiome Times, and I do a lot of writing about sort of biotechnology and how this area of the microbiome is going to lead to new diagnostics and treatments. And also sort of more, consumer-friendly stuff on probiotics or gut health in general. So I love digging in. Every new writing assignment is an opportunity to learn more and talk to cool people. So yeah, that's what's keeping me busy.
Nice. So if people want to read or subscribe to what you're doing, where can they do that?
They can go to my website by Kris Campbell. That's BYKRIS Campbell.com. And I have a section there that has a list of my work under the My Work section. And there are different articles, some of my favorites from over the years, and they're all in different categories. So if someone has a specific area they're interested in, they can read up on it there. And I also tweet a lot. So it's by Kris Campbell, and dialogue with a lot of the scientists in the field, and have a lot of fun learning again on Twitter. So
great.
Yeah.
Well, I will have all those in the show notes. Kristina, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was really interesting.
Thank you so much, Lucas. It was a pleasure.
I enjoyed having Kristina on. I hope you did too. So to summarize a few of her tips through the episode, she said probiotics and prebiotics were how you could approach altering your microbiome. For probiotics, she suggested you look for brands that list the actual strains on the packaging. So, if you're looking at a label and it just says Lactobacillus acidophilus, that could be, one of hundreds of different kinds of Lactobacillus acidophilus. Lactobacillus is basically the genus, acidophilus is the species, and for the strain, you want to see letters or numbers or something like that after the word acidophilus. So it would look like Lactobacillus acidophilus DDS1 with a little trademark symbol to kind of let you know it's a trademarked ingredient. Speaking of trademarked ingredients, often they have more studies on them. They have standardized amounts of active ingredients. So you kind of know what you're getting, what you're paying for. However, often the studies on them are kind of thinly veiled marketing. It's hard to trust what they find because, the better the study, the better the sales, basically. So there are some pluses and minuses with trademarked ingredients. I tend to think the pluses outweigh the minuses, but that isn't always the case. Kristina, she liked the liquid probiotics and mentioned kefir as a probiotic food that can shift the microbiome. As far as prebiotics go, Kristina liked resistant starch, XOS, FOS, and fiber. She mentioned that the more varied types of fiber you have, the more diversity you're going to get with your microbiome, and that tends to be a positive thing for your health. I will put a personal note in about the resistant starch, though. Years ago, when people first started getting into resistant starch, the way to do it was to eat potato starch. And so I remember buying 5 bags of Bob's Red Mill's potato starch, thinking, it was going to be this thing that I consume every day. And some people found it helped them lose weight, sleep better and have more energy. But others found it really made them feel bad, almost the exact opposite. And I was in that latter category. So like most things for the microbiome, your reaction is really highly personalized, and you're going to have to experiment to see what works for you. So now for a personal update, I've been messing around with my gut and the microbiome now since January. And I have a whole podcast written about this really cool gut protocol I did. It was awesome, but I'm just kind of waiting for Brian to get back into the picture before I share it. But one particularly interesting experiment that I wanted to share involved Akkermansia, which is one of the bugs that I asked Kristina about. So Ken Lasseson's website said there are studies showing polyphenols from cranberries and maybe pomegranates could increase Akkermansia. Polyphenols are basically like their food. So I took cranberry pills and drank cranberry juice for about a month and a half. And I timed it so I started the cranberry right after my last microbiome test so that my next microbiome test would show if it worked at growing Akkermansia. Now, I personally have low Akkermansia levels. They're around 0.001%. Now, before that, you think that sounds, oh my gosh, that's so low. Normal levels are 0.018%. So, it's not like you got these guys coming out your ears or anything. So anyway, after doing the cranberry for a month and a half, I did a gut test at the end of April, and I found that my Akkermansia levels had risen from 0.001% to 0.002%. So not that impressive, to be honest. I was expecting maybe levels closer to normal. I will say often bacteria grow in exponential ways. So, if I continue on with the cranberry, maybe my next test will show 0.004%, which would mean to me it just kind of takes a while for these little guys to get going. Overall, though, don't expect cranberry to magically cure low levels of Akkermansia. I may give the the probiotic that Kristina mentioned, the pendulum probiotic, a try, which has Akkermansia in it. It's a little spendy though, so I kind of have to decide if it's worth the investment. And living in Arizona, I wonder about shipping it right now too. A friend on Twitter already ordered pendulum, so I'll share his results when he lets me know. Check out the show notes for links on all this stuff, as well as some product links to prebiotics on Amazon you may be interested in trying. If you get value from the show and you can help us out by shopping through our Amazon banner on our website, we would be deeply grateful. Next podcast is going to be about how to improve your vision in as little as 2 weeks with simple and time-tested methods. So keep your eye out on that in the next couple weeks. Thanks for listening. Be well.